So you're like the merciless.
Okay, so I think to do this next unit, the Algebra 1 at the high school, they spent about 1 to 2 weeks on this because they had not went over it this year. But we have went over it this year, so I'm just kind of doing this review. But to do this next unit, you're really going to have to understand how exponents work. So at the beginning of the year, we kind of made this book to where you wrote each one. So one rule you have to memorize is power of 0. And at this point, everybody, yeah, y'all did it in class. Any base raised to 0 power is equal to 1. So it doesn't matter if it's a short example or if it's a whole bunch of stuff in parentheses. If it's raised to 0 power, it's always going to be equal to 1. Then we went over how do you change a negative exponent to a positive exponent. Rylan, how do you change a negative exponent to a positive exponent? What did you tell me earlier? You could put it over 1, but unless it's on the bottom. So, but each time you just have to do what to that base? Reciprocate it. So it just depends. So when you have a base that has a negative exponent, you reciprocate the base and change the exponent to a positive. So if the exponent is a numerator, then it becomes a denominator. But there's going to be cases at which the base is a denominator, and if it's down on the bottom, then you're going to have to make it up here on the top. So those were some things that we did earlier in the year. So it just depends on what you're doing. So it could be flipped either way. Then we went over the rule of how do you multiply like bases. Liam, what's the rule for how do you multiply like bases? Okay, and what do you do with the bases? Keep it. So the rule that we wrote earlier was when you multiply like bases, you keep the base and add the exponent. So if it's 8 squared times 8 to the 3rd, it just becomes 8 to the 5th. Now, you could have some very, very complicated ones. So you group the bases that are like together, the 4s, the x's, the y's, and the z, and then you just do one thing at a time. If you end up having a negative exponent, then they would expect you to simplify it, and if the x is on top, it ends up going on the bottom. Then we went over divide like bases. Hayden, how do you divide like bases? And which exponent do you put in the calculator first? Where's that located at? On the top. Okay, so when you divide like bases, you keep the base and subtract the exponent, so you do top minus bottom. So it'd be like 10 take away 6, you get positive 4. But sometimes when you do top minus bottom, see how in this example you just grouped all the base 6, x, y, and z. When you do top minus bottom, sometimes it turns out to be a negative exponent, so then you end up having to flip it over and move it to the bottom. Then the last rule we went over is power to a power. Rainey, how do you do a power to a power? You multiply. So when it's power to power, you have another power raised to another power, so you have to multiply them, and that's your shortcut. But remember, if you have parentheses, that power of 3 goes to every single base that's in there. So every one of those exponents had to be multiplied by 3. And then if you have any exponents that are negative, then you have to end up reciprocating it. So anybody have any questions on that right there? Anything? Do what? Well, it goes back.